Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad to welcome you as part of our community tonight. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and distributed live stream. By entering this virtual meeting room, you give your consent to be recorded and distributed by Simeon Morrow Public Speaking Presentations, Vienna Live with Simeon Morrow, and other third parties. If you prefer to not be recorded, please turn off your camera and microphone and/or go to the Facebook Live video feed, the link to which I will now place in the chat room. For a better experience, please turn off your microphone and set your video to gallery view. This show thrives on participant contributions, and all participants are encouraged to actively participate in this webinar by asking questions and making comments. To do so, please either write in the chat room, raise your hand, or turn on your microphone and say hi, and I'll be delighted to include your perspective in the conversation. Tonight, our featured guest is University Professor Dr. Philip Auslander, Professor of Performance Studies and Popular Musicology at Georgia Tech. Among the literature we will discuss tonight is Professor Auslander's book, In Concert, Performing Musical Persona, which was published by the University of Michigan Press in 2021.
As a tribute to Frédéric Chopin, we take you to the home of Arthur Rubinstein, one of the most distinguished interpreters of his works, where Mr. Rubinstein pays homage to the memory of this great master.
So that was Arthur Rubinstein playing Chopin in 1953, yet on page 87 of Professor Auslander's book, In Concert, Performing Musical Persona, he writes, quote, "It does not necessarily follow that simply because the verb to perform demands a direct object, that the object of performance must be a text such as choreography, a dramatic script, or a musical work, or even a less fully defined text such as a scenario or lead sheet. Many other things can be understood to be performed. Personal identity may be seen as something one performs. For instance, one can speak of performing a self in daily life just as readily as one speaks of performing a text in a theater or concert hall. In short, the direct object of the verb to perform need not be something. It can also be someone, an identity rather than a work or text," end quote. Professor Auslander in 2006, this somewhat cryptic and understated article called Musical Personae appeared in the pages of The Drama Review. It turns out that that article was a pioneering concept in performance studies that would heavily influence the field of musicology. Up to then, a field focused on the concept of musicians performing a text rather than an identity. It is telling that the article was published in the Drama Review and not for a periodical called something like the Music Review. Tell us how this article came to be.
Well, thank you. Pleasure to be here. Um, so basically, I have been a fan of various kinds of music for essentially all of my sentient life. And I noticed once I became, a scholar, working in theater and performance studies, that people on in my end of things weren't talking about musicians as performers. I mean, performance studies was supposed to be a sort of more expansive field than theater studies, looking at all manner of performance or looking at the world through the lens of performance. But certain things just seemed to be kind of blank spots, and music was one of them at the time, where people in theater and performance studies just didn't really seem to want to talk about music. I mean, one version of this, which I mentioned in the book, is that my theater history teacher, who was a very distinguished theater historian who wrote a basic textbook, in this book says that opera is not part of the history of theater because opera is driven by music and theater is driven by drama. Um, which to me is ridiculous, honestly. I mean, I don't see why opera should be left out of the history of theater, but it just speaks to a certain attitude, right? That if it involves music, somehow it's something different. It's not really what we're talking about. So and then on the other side, musicologists, as you mentioned, with the partial exception of ethnomusicologists, for the most part, were not particularly concerned about performance, but much more concerned about text, the musical works as text. So I thought, okay, well, here's kind of a gap. Here's something that I thought at any rate needed to be addressed, and so I set about doing so. The first article I published was not that one; it was an early one about called Performance Analysis and Popular Music, to sort of start out by arguing that performances of music can be looked at and analyzed in the way that theatrical performances can be, essentially, even though at the time very, very few people were inclined to do this sort of thing. Um, and it is true that, I mean, that the piece I just alluded to was published in a theater journal. The piece you mentioned was published in the Drama Review. And I mean, partly because this is, these are my venues, so to say, as someone who is coming from theater and into performance studies. But I have to say that anytime I set foot in other disciplinary territory, I make sure that I have some credibility. So I have published a few articles, including a fairly early one in all this, in music journals as well. And I also made a point of attending music conferences and so on, just to make sure that the ideas had some credibility on both sides. But that's essentially where this all started, probably 15, 20 years ago, just with my desire to find a way of talking about musicians as performers that didn't seem to be happening in the existing fields.
Okay, and tell us a little bit about what we just saw with Arthur Rubinstein. So there is part of maybe what you're talking about. They mention first and foremost, they don't mention Arthur Rubinstein. They mention his home, and that's where he has as an honored guest Frederick Chopin. We see the picture of Chopin. It's almost a Byzantine kind of two-dimensional picture. Something you don't want to put him into any kind of human form. We've got this godlike person, overlooking Rubinstein, who plays with his eyes closed. He's trying to, move out of his body, and even though he's in this incredibly luxurious apartment with all of the lights and the very fashionable clothes and all that, and of course, an extremely, extremely expensive piece of musical hardware. So where does that all fit in?
Well, I mean, first of all, I like that clip indeed because the portrait of Chopin at the beginning, just sort of speaks to the kind of tradition of musicology in which the composer is viewed as the dominant figure, not the performer, even though this is a video, of course, focusing on a particular performer, or a film originally, obviously. Um, but it still has that, it still kind of speaks to that kind of traditional view. Um, and it also, I mean, I hope we'll see the Glenn Gould clip later on to compare and contrast. But it also, for me, represents a version of a kind of traditional persona for the concert pianist. Is very dignified, sort of magisterial figure who sits at the keyboard with great presence and so on, and which speaks to part of my point about musical persona, which is that the parameters of the persona are determined, might be too strong a word, but are certainly heavily influenced by the particular musical context. So the fact that Rubinstein sits the way he does, dresses the way he does, presents this very kind of dignified and serious affect would not necessarily be appropriate for a rock pianist, for example. So there's a way in which Rubinstein's persona, the way he presents himself, is keyed to the expectations of the performance situation and the kind of music that he's playing. And I also argue that within any sort of musical context, there's a sort of norm for how musicians are expected to present themselves. And I think that Rubinstein represents a version of the norm for his time, right? Because that's the other thing. The way in which musicians are expected to present themselves is not static. It changes over time. So he represents a particular moment in the development of that figure of the concert pianist. But the other thing I want to point out, just going back to sort of the idea of performance analysis, is that you can use words. I do use words like dignified and etc. I like the word magisterial to describe someone like him. But there are lots of different ways of being magisterial, right? So if you look at Rubinstein, he's got one sort of way of doing it. Another pianist I've looked at a lot is Alfred Brendel, who's quite different in the way that he addresses the instrument and the way that he performs. But you could still certainly describe him as magisterial and dignified and so on. So you need to sort of get a step beyond that kind of level of description. I really like to look closely at exactly what the performer is doing. So the fact that Rubinstein is leaning back and has his hands on the keyboard, but at quite a distance from himself, is quite different from someone like, say, Brendel, who tends to lean over the keyboard more. And so all these things contribute to the particular character of the persona, even though the persona is also always in line with certain kinds of expectations of what this kind of performance is supposed to look like.
Okay, so let's go further into this with our first roundtable. What is a musical persona? On page 88, Professor Auslander writes, quote, "The analysis I propose here entails thinking of musicians as social beings in the sense that to be a musician is to perform an identity in a social realm that is defined in relation to the realm. In describing the various forms of an actor's presence, various forms an actor's presence can assume, David Graeber differentiates the actor's presence before the audience as a publicly visible person from the character portrayed and calls this kind of presence the actor's personnage. Graeber is at pains to stress that, quote, this personage is not the real person behind the character. Personage status is not a foundational reality, but simply another way of representing oneself, or rather, a way of representing oneself within a particular discursive domain, end quote. It is easiest to provide examples from the realm of celebrity actors. For instance, there are at least 3 Jack Nicholsons layered into any of his filmed performances: the real person, the celebrity movie star, Graeber's personage, and the actor portraying a character. As Graeber suggests, the audience inevitably reads character through personage. We do not just see the character Nicholson portrays, we see Nicholson portraying a character. The Nicholson personage is not simply equivalent to the real person, it is the version of self Jack Nicholson performs in the discursive domain of movie stardom. It is important, however, that Graeber also insists that the concept of personage is not restricted to celebrities. Watching any actor perform, we have the sense of being in the presence of a liminal phenomenon that mediates between the real person and the character. I argue that when we see a musician perform, we are not simply seeing the real person playing, As with actors, there is an entity that mediates between musicians and the act of performance. When we hear a musician play, the source of the sound is a version of that person constructed for the specific purpose of playing music under particular circumstances. Musical performance may be defined, using Graeber's terms, as a person's representation of musical identity within a specific discursive domain of music. I posit that in musical performance, this representation is the direct object of the verb to perform. In the schema, I am proposing both the musical work and its execution serve the musician's performance of a persona. What musicians perform first and foremost is not music, but their own identities as musicians, their musical personae, end quote. Professor Auslander, tell us now more about the musical persona. We focused there on Rubinstein being magisterial and sitting back at the piano. There are several Arthur Rubinsteins. Can you tell us about them?
No, I don't know if I can tell if I can talk about the several Arthur Rubinsteins, but the basic point of all this is that what I consider to be the musical persona, which is defined in that section that you read, is essentially a version of the person constructed for the purpose of playing music and a certain kind of presentation before an audience in that capacity. And yeah, some of it is just very simple. Like you don't assume that Arthur Rubinstein, always sits that way or always dresses that way, right? I mean, he does these things specifically in his guise as musician. And it's that guise as musician that I call the persona. And it's something different from, even though in certain instances, in certain cases, we as the audience want to believe that we are seeing the real person. I would suggest that we are not. We are seeing a version of the person designed and constructed for the purpose of performing music, a particular kind of music for a particular kind of audience. And I sort of, in the course of working all of this out, I actually sort of moved away from those three terms that Graeber uses and ultimately gravitated toward three other terms, which are the real person. So that would be the biographical Arthur Rubinstein, the musical persona, which is what Rubinstein becomes when he performs. And then there's a third entity called a character, which only comes in primarily for singers who portray. This is a little bit closer to acting than the rest of what I'm talking about, but for singers who portray characters through songs, right? Because part of the fundamental idea that a lot of this departed from, or the question really, was, since my background as a performer is as an actor, that's sort of my default understanding of what performance is, as I think it is for many people. And so when I started thinking about musicians, I started thinking, okay, well, musicians are performers, obviously, but what kind of performers? Are they like actors? And my immediate answer was not exactly, because actors are in the business of portraying fictional characters and musicians largely are not, right? You're not playing a character who is a cellist, you are performing as a cellist. You're still not just being yourself, however, you're being the cellist. So there's that middle term, that sort of idea that you're not being yourself, that you've constructed this other entity, but this other entity is not best described as a fictional character. Therefore, what you are doing is not best described as acting, but something else. And I used that term persona before because I've always been interested in trying to find a way of talking about kinds of performance that involve entities that aren't the same as the person performing them, but also aren't overtly fictional characters, that are somewhere in between those two poles. And so I had used the term before in a few different contexts, including that of stand-up comedy, which it seems to me is another fairly good example of a situation where you're looking at a person performing through an entity created specifically for the purpose of that kind of performance, and is not necessarily equivalent or even similar to the real person. The other thing I do have to stress, though, is that with musicians, of course, sometimes musicians do portray fictional characters, and so that does happen. My assumption though is that those are the relatively exceptional cases. That the sort of normal case for most kinds of music is the musician presents themselves as a musician, which is understood to be a version of themselves and not a fictional entity. So I was trying to kind of figure all that out in working out this concept.
Okay, and before we move on, Professor Auslander, so just to be clear, you said that some opera singers or opera singers, they are portraying a character. When I was going to music school, all of the pianists, for instance, that when they played a recital, they had to play a Bach prelude and fugue, and then they had to play maybe a piece of French music, and then they had to play a Beethoven sonata, for example. Would each one of those pieces and the sound that they make and the way that they play the piano, does that constitute a different personage? We just saw Rubinstein playing, and I could hear in my mind that letter that Debussy apparently wrote to his professor, if I'm not mistaken, saying that, he wanted the piano, the hammers of the piano to disappear. He didn't want the piano to be a percussive instrument, which is impossible, right? But it seems to me that's the way Rubinstein is playing. He wants to have a very melodic sound. Is that also a personage?
That's a good question, actually. I mean, I guess broadly speaking, I would say that, yeah, the style of performing does go hand in hand with the development of the persona. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Okay, fantastic. So let's move on now to roundtable 2, Life as a Stage, according to Irving Goffman. On page 95, Professor Auslander writes, quote, as Goffman suggests, we perform ourselves differently in our different routines. I do not present myself in the same way to my students in the classroom as I do to my departmental colleagues at meetings, for instance. Therefore, there is no reason to suppose that musicians perform the same identity when playing music as in their other life routines. The version of self that a musician performs qua musician is what I am calling the musical persona. Goffman's theory allows for the possibility that any given self-presentation in a social interaction can be a sincere presentation of a person's real feelings at the time, partly or wholly fictional. For example, if a student greets me on campus and asks how I am, I may respond that I am fine, even when I am not feeling that way. I thus present myself as a fictional character, at least at this moment of the interaction. Unlike theories of acting that focus on how a real person may assume the identity of a fictional character, Goffman's concept of self-presentation applies equally well to fictional and non-fictional representations. From this perspective, the seemingly sincere demeanor of a singer-songwriter like James Taylor and the overtly stylized and artificial lounge lizard persona of Brian Ferry with Roxy Music are equally self-presentations. Whether real, fictional, or some combination of both, they are identities designed to create an impression of who the musician is in relation to a specific audience, identities that both define and adhere to the norms for a genre of music. End quote. Professor Auslander, who was Irving Goffman and why is the concept of musical persona based on his theoretical concepts?
Okay, so Irving Goffman was an American-Canadian sociologist, or Canadian-American sociologist, who was sort of frequently associated with a sort of mid-century Chicago school of sociology, the interactionist school. Whoops. Okay. Oh, there he is. Yes. Hi. Um, okay. The reason why I gravitated, first of all, I'm a big fan of Irving Goffman, but besides that, the reason I gravitated to his approach goes back to what I was saying before, that musicians perform, but for the most part, especially if you're looking at an Arthur Rubinstein, for example, he's not portraying a fictional character. There's no reason to say that he's acting. So I needed another way of talking about what he is doing. And so Goffman's idea of self-presentation, from his very famous 1959 book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, provides a vocabulary for talking about that. So I came to the understanding that it was probably more productive to talk about musicians performing on stage as engaging in self-presentation than as engaging in acting. And so I use a lot of Goffman's ideas and terminology for talking about this and fleshing it out. Now, the particular passage you just read might require a little explanation, because what happened, and it exemplifies the fact that I changed my mind about certain things along the way. So that passage appears it's from sort of a later version of this material than the original article. But I sort of realized at a certain point that, having chosen to go with Goffman and chosen to go with this idea of self-presentation as opposed to acting and the creation of a fictional identity, that I had put a little too much stress on the difference between self-presentation and acting, which tended then to imply that self-presentation represents a truth in the way that acting does not. Acting necessarily represents a fiction, and by putting self-presentation sort of against that, I seem to be implying that self-presentation is necessarily, in a sense, factual. You're seeing the real person. But that was just sort of a moment of blindness on my part, because if you read Goffman, as that passage you read points out, it's very clear that from his point of view, self-presentations are not necessarily factual. Right? You present yourself in the way that you feel you need to in a given situation. So if someone says, "How are you?" The socially defined response is, "I'm fine," right? And nobody really wants to hear, "Well, actually, I'm not feeling so well today," right? Even though that may be true, right? So you are in fact presenting yourself at that moment as a fictional character who's feeling well when you are not. And then in the next moment, you may present yourself, in a completely accurate way. So the line between fact and fiction and self-presentation is a very blurry one. And I think I had originally made it seem a little too pat, right? Musicians are not engaged in presenting fictional characters, therefore they're making self-presentations. But I sort of lost the idea that those self-presentations can involve fiction as well as not. So that was sort of the somewhat more complicated view that I kind of came up with a bit later on, so as not to seem to be kind of placing in opposition musicians like, say, James Taylor, who appeared to be, a version of their real self on stage, and someone like, well, Brian Ferry at that time, who did not at all seem to be like his real self. I mean, he seemed to be portraying a completely, a fictional entity of some kind. But in fact, both of those are self-presentations, right? And again, as I was saying before, with respect to Rubinstein's way of playing the piano, as opposed to, say, a rock musician's playing the piano, and the different persona and that entails, the same thing is true for James Taylor and Brian Ferry. I mean, James Taylor, as in the context of singer-songwriter, which is a genre in which you are supposed to be able to believe that the person is telling you a story, singing from their own experience, as opposed to the kind of glam rock that Brian Ferry was performing at that time, which is overtly artificial, and there's no expectation that the person is somehow representing themselves in a factual or autobiographical or whatever manner. So both of those presentations were appropriate to the particular context. By context, I always mean genre, music, and audience. But those presentations were geared to the particular different contexts in which they were performing.
And Phil, to follow up on that about Arthur Rubinstein, for example, he is also wearing, then I imagine, the socially defined costume for
Yeah.
that persona. Maybe he likes to play piano with golf shoes on and sweatpants, but he's forced to in order to for his audience sake, he has to wear that tuxedo and have his hair nice. Maybe he doesn't have gray hair. Maybe it's actually different color.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing about that is that if you look at different kinds of music, the there are some contexts, some genres or types of music where the strictures around performance are pretty severe. And then there are others where it's much more open-ended, right? So, I mean, rock musicians, for example, have a great deal more. If you're just talking about visual presentation, they have a lot more options with respect to, for example, costume than classical, symphonic musicians who always have to dress in a very specific way. I actually, in just in sort of poking around, doing some kind of research, I ran across a document which is a musician's contract for the Phoenix Symphony Orchestra, which is incredibly detailed as to how the musicians have to dress, and the differences between, how you're supposed to dress for the normal season versus playing during the summer, and and so on. I mean, but it's spelled out in such detail that it really leaves the musician no options as far as at least the visual side of their presentation. The other thing, since this has sort of come up, the other thing I want to point out is that any given musician also performs different personae under different circumstances. Um, Even if we're talking about the same kind of music. What I mean, for example, is if you play in a symphony, when you're playing in the symphony, unless you're the concert master or a soloist or something like that, your self-presentation is basically expected to be self-effacing. You're not supposed to stand out from the crowd. You're supposed to blend into the crowd, right? The crowd being the orchestra. However, that same person performing a recital as a soloist can take on a very different kind of persona, right? Where, because in that context, they are expected to be visible and they are expected to, present a more individualized image than they are when they're playing with the orchestra. So the particulars of the circumstances under which the person is performing also have a lot to do with the particulars of the persona, and that can vary a lot for a particular musician, just depending on the circumstances.
Fantastic. This brings us to our third roundtable very nicely. So we're going to do some case studies. The first one is going to be about Glenn Gould, but first we're going to do a little slideshow to talk about high key, so-called high key and so-called low key persona. So here's first, we have Kiss, which I believe are a high key persona. So we have very clearly, we can tell right away that they are musical persona. They are dressed a little bit different than one might be to go outside and walk the dog. So we have here some persona. Then we go on to Lady Gaga. And Phil, you take over and tell us whatever, how you see things.
Well, these are, I mean, these are fairly recent images of Lady Gaga. What I found really interesting about her and her approach to the whole issue of persona, yeah, that's better, is that especially early on in her career, this is still true to some extent, but especially early on in her career, um, it was actually pretty hard to understand what Lady Gaga, what the person herself, Stephanie Germanotta, actually looks like, right? Because she appeared in so many different guises, so many different, costumes, often using things that made it almost impossible to really see her face, which is no longer true. You can now see her face quite readily. And in her music videos, she would appear as multiple different characters. I mean, there's one video that I analyzed of hers where I think there are 12 or 13 different versions of her. So she really had this sort of idea of proliferating different personae, which is in the context of popular music is a very interesting one because usually there's a kind of expectation that the persona is relatively stable and that helps with branding and things like that. But she really went against all that, and her persona was really this constantly sort of mutating thing, that was very, very hard to pin down in any way, which I thought was a really interesting approach. and quite different from someone like David Bowie, who was famous for continually transforming his persona, which he did typically in relation to whatever album or tour he was on at the given time. But his approach to it, and he was sort of a pioneer of this, of not having a stable persona, but sort of remaking himself continuously. But his remaking himself was always geared toward sort of, music business structures like tours and albums. So for each tour, each album, he would develop a new persona. Whereas Gaga, it just seemed like she was just throwing off personas that, constantly. It didn't have anything to do with sort of, any particular association with a particular album or a particular moment in her career. It was just this constant remorphing and remaking of herself. That seemed to be a kind of, I don't know, end in itself, in a sense. Oh, I do want to say the term that I like to use for talking about, that's Gwar, yes. Gwar is this a heavy metal band that perform in these foam outfits that cover them pretty much completely. And so their onstage persona is a set of fictional characters, which are embedded in a very complicated narrative of who they are and what their relationships are that's been going on for years. But that's a kind of extreme case of the musical persona as a clearly fictional entity. The word I like to use, this is again a relatively recent decision on my part for all this, is rather than high key and low key so much, is theatrical. So the degree of theatricality involved in a persona has become for me a kind of something to look at, a kind of sliding scale from James Taylor, right? Here he is, James Taylor, who would be at the low end of theatricality, to Kiss or Gwar or whatever, who would be at the high end of theatricality. So theatricality is kind of variable quantity that one can talk about in terms of defining different approaches to persona in different genre contexts and other contexts.
And Phil, you're also saying that these someone like James Taylor or Joni Mitchell, that the persona they display is also kind of clearly supposed to be their real, who they would be. It's kind of trying
Right.
to pretend that they're not actually performing a persona.
Right, exactly. Which doesn't mean they're not. It just means that we want to believe that they're not, and they want us to believe that they're not.
There's Joni Mitchell with her cigarette, which I believe is also part of her persona.
Well, at that time it was, yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so now we will go on to the complimentary part of where we began this show. This is to look at Glenn Gould and see how his musical persona or personae are different from that of Arthur Rubinstein.
Here he works on the piano he favors above all others for practicing. A 70-year-old Chickering with a resonant, harpsichord-like quality, recalling the instruments of the time of Bach.
Yeah.
So there we have it. Unfortunately, we got cut off by a commercial, but we got to see a little bit of Glenn Gould. So Phil, there we have it. I guess he's in his bathrobe and he's singing
Yes.
along. He's playing a persona in which he's pretending that actually nobody's watching him.
Right. Well, that is true. There is this fiction surrounding that documentary that that he's, yeah. I mean, the same thing is true with Rubinstein, though. I mean, these are both. I like to think of these, like to look at these videos or think about these two things side by side, because in certain ways they're similar. You're supposedly getting a kind of candid view of the musician performing in his home, although obviously Rubinstein's home is much more theatrical than Glenn Gould's. I mean, considering the way he's dressed, the way all of his guests are dressed, they're all dressed as if they were going out to the opera, even though they're supposedly just hanging around his living room listening to him play. So it's interesting to put these two things side by side. And of course, in both cases, there is a fiction that they're not being watched by us, when of course they are. But the other thing I want to mention, and with respect to Gould, is a good opportunity to point out also that musical persona is not defined just by what the musician does on stage. There are lots of other outlets or venues in which the person performs that persona. So, for example, Glenn Gould is a particularly good example of this because his persona was very carefully constructed through media, including this documentary film, which is called Off the Record, which was produced by the Film Board of Canada in 1959. And there's a companion one called On the Record, which shows Gould in a recording studio in New York making an album. And so between that and various photo spreads and articles about him, photos of him, images of him, these things also play into the construction of the persona. It's not just what the musician does on stage, but all the different places, interviews, all the different places where the musician appears as a kind of public figure. And it's pretty clear that in Gould's case, this was fairly carefully orchestrated to create a very distinctive and, of course, eccentric persona for him. And it's also very interesting how much it goes against the kind of traditional concert pianist persona represented by Rubinstein, right? I mean, this, of course, the two films are only 6 years apart, but obviously Rubinstein and Gould are very different, of very different generations of musicians. And I think that, the later generation represented by Gould is kind of pushing back against certain things that define the previous generation. But in that sense, I mean, what he does is almost completely the opposite of what you see Rubinstein doing. I mean, he's not dressed up. He's wearing his bathrobe. There's a coffee cup sitting on top of the piano. It just seems like he just kind of rolled out of bed and starts playing. He's singing along. He's gesticulating. He doesn't have that kind of composed, dignified affect that Rubinstein has. There's a point in which, in this video where you saw it, that at one point he takes one of his hands off the keyboard, but there's another point where he, puts his arms across each other. And there's another point where he's playing the piano like this, like he was Chico Marx or something. So it's just a totally different kind of idea of what a classical pianist is, right? And it's a completely, almost diametrically opposed kind of construction of persona than what we saw with Rubinstein, which is much more conventional and much more traditional. So there are a couple of things to be thought about here. I mean, one is just that, even though there obviously are very well-defined conventions surrounding something like classical piano music, or what it is to be a classical pianist, that doesn't mean that any given pianist has to adhere to those, right? So you have someone like Gould who got away with essentially, presenting himself in a totally different way. And I'm very interested in trying to understand kind of the dynamics behind that, or in other words, how does he get away with that in a sense? I mean, I have some ideas about it, but it's interesting to sort of think about how that can happen, how someone can go so far away from the norm. The other thing that's kind of interesting and prescient in that video is that the other thing that's sitting on the top of the piano, besides the coffee cup, is a reel of recording tape. And of course, I think 5 years after this documentary was made, Gould would stop performing publicly. And stop doing concerts and only perform in the recording studio. So that reel of tape is suggestive of something that's that's going on. The other thing I'll just quickly mention, in case anybody wants to look for it, is that there's another video, a very, very interestingly shot video of Gould performing Bach, of course, Goldberg variations, I believe, in a recording studio near the end of his life. And it's very interesting to watch that in relation to this one, because the older Gould is very different from this young, kind of wacky, exuberant figure. And it's actually quite poignant to look at those two things side by side, and sort of see, what the kind of persona that he grew into, in a sense, as an older musician.
Bill, and before we move on now to the Beatles, I just wanted to run by you what I saw. The stage, though, seems to, on a larger identity level, both these two videos seem to speak to a wealthy European bourgeoisie. They're both, Gould, he's in his legacy summer home where he grew up,
Right.
with this huge piano. I mean, Rubinstein in some wealthy New York apartment. They both seem to talk about, speak directly to the audience watching them on TV who could afford TVs at that time. Is that also a way of saying, okay, well, these are all part of the music, classical music that speaks to us?
Well, sure. Actually, that's a really good point. That's not something I'd particularly thought about with respect to these videos. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And it does have something to do. I'm not sure. Another interesting question, and it really is a question because I don't know the answer. I don't know what. I mean, obviously, these were shot originally on film, both the Rubinstein and the Gould. And I don't know exactly whether they were meant to be shown on television or in theaters or what. So I'm not exactly sure what the idea was of how these would be distributed, or exhibited. But that said, I take your point. I think you're absolutely right that, it seems these in different ways they seem to be speaking to the same demographic that you would find in the concert hall, right? Typically, and this has become ever more true, unfortunately, that classical music has become an ever more elitist enterprise. And so, yeah, that's a good point that there are certain ways in which these depictions of the musicians play into that.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's go into the Beatles now. I'm going to show a picture while I read from the book. So on page, referring to the musical personae of the Beatles, Professor Auslander writes on page 120, quote, "But some musical performers find ways of letting their personae change successfully over time. Compare the Beatles in 1963, when they were essentially a very talented boy band, with the Beatles in 1968, when they were recognized as countercultural avatars. During the era of Beatlemania in the mid-1960s, the Beatles had a collective identity of a cheerful, user-friendly, slightly irreverent boy band. Each Beatle had his own persona, but all of their personae had to harmonize with this group affect. By 1967, however, the Beatles' group persona had morphed into that of a psychedelic rock band plugged into the countercultural ethos of the time. Both At both moments, each individual Beatles persona was articulated, whereas in the 1960s, mid-1960s fans dubbed Paul McCartney the cute Beatle, John Lennon the smart Beatle, George Harrison the quiet Beatle, and Ringo Starr the funny Beatle. Their individual identities shifted in relation to the group's overall persona. In Richard Avedon's canonical portrait photographs of 1967, which we're looking at right now, originally published in Look magazine in the United States and other magazines in the United Kingdom and Europe, then disseminated widely as posters, Ringo is shown with a dove in his hand, suggesting his commitment to the peace and love dimension of the counterculture, while John Lennon is presented with spirals in his eyes, perhaps indicating his engagement with psychedelia and the drug culture. Paul appears as a flower child in pastel blues, surrounded by blooms, and the portrait of George emphasized his mysticism. End quote. Professor Auslander, how, why, and how much did the Beatles change their musical personae?
Well, they changed a lot. um, this is, I would say that in the course of their career, the Beatles went through at least four different types of persona. Before I get into that, though, I do want to just underline this idea of there being that this idea of persona operates both at the individual and the collective level. So that the Beatles as a group, there is a group persona, and then each one has an individual persona, and obviously the individual persona has to fit into the group persona. But I would say that, all musical ensembles constitute a group persona of some kind, right? Um, uh, the particulars of that vary obviously from uh, situation to situation, but in all cases there is a kind of group persona, and then there are individual personas which have to fit into and make sense in the context of the group. So this is as true of a symphony orchestra as it is of a rock band. The Beatles are an interesting case. One of the reasons I brought them up in the book is because they really underwent a radical change of persona between, as I said, the early kind of Beatlemania boy band persona, and then this, much different, possibly drugged out, certainly, politically engaged and so on, personas that they assumed in the second half of the 1960s as they became kind of avatars of the counterculture. One of the things that's interesting about this, or one of the questions around this, is kind of how do you do that? I mean, you build up a certain expectation with your audience as to who you are, and then you change that, right? Um, and what how do you keep an audience? How do you, since the audience? I basically believe that audiences are conservative, and I don't mean that in a political sense. I mean in the sense that you come back to see what you saw before. So you basically want what you had last time. And the Beatles really didn't do that. I mean, around 1966, they made a radical change of persona. And they did lose audience. I mean, for a different project, I eventually did some research into Beatle fans to sort of see what they had to say. That wasn't actually what I was looking for, but I found it anyway. And there definitely were people who, once the Beatles sort of moved in this kind of countercultural direction, said, "Nope, not for me. I liked them before, but I don't like them anymore." And they jumped ship, right? So they definitely lost audience through that transformation. But I presume, I don't know the numbers, I presume that they gained enough new audience to remain, one of the perhaps the single most important rock band in the world at the time, right? But there's a risk involved in this, and there is the risk that you will lose the affection of your audience, essentially, who knows you to be or knows you in a certain way through a certain persona, group, and individual. And then when you change that, you're taking the risk of alienating them, essentially. And the Beatles negotiated that risk. Other groups have not been so successful in making transformations of that kind. So it's interesting to think about, what's involved, or how it comes to pass that some groups like the Beatles can do it very successfully, and then other groups don't have as much success sort of changing or transforming themselves along the way, because their audience really just wants them to be what they think they've always been. And when you look at the Beatles' career as a whole, as I said before, there are at least four phases. There was one before the sort of Beatlemania boy band, in which they were, dressed in black leather and with a much tougher look, and played, much more raucous rock and roll music, which then the edges got kind of sanded off of that a little bit during the boy band phase. Then there was the psychedelic phase, and then there was one more phase, which is the sort of, if you watch the endless documentary Get Back, what is that, 8 hours or something? You can see that one in action, but it's a much more kind of roots rocker persona at that point. So they actually, they changed, their personas changed fairly, not frequently, but fairly regularly in the course of their career, as they kind of navigated different musical ideas, different cultural ideas, different social settings, and so on. So it's an interesting particular case, and I don't think that people always think about it in these terms. Sort of look at these kinds of transformations of identity that a group like the Beatles undertook.
Okay.
Oh, and the other thing I want to mention, by the way, is that, I mean, it's sort of been implicit, but it is not necessarily, in fact, I would say probably it's usually not the case that the musician as an individual is the sole author of their persona. So we've already talked about the degree of conformity that's expected of classical musicians. So they are not the sole authors of their personae, though of course they can bring different aspects of their personality to it, nevertheless. And likewise, I wrote a piece about the Beatles earlier, the Beatlemania phase of the Beatles. And I mean, I'm not saying anything that nobody know, anything that's not known, but certainly their manager at the time, Brian Epstein, had a lot to do with the first transformation of them from these kind of black leather clad rockers into this much more palatable boy band. And he undertook that transformation in very specific and very clear ways. So, there are always multiple things that come into the definition of the persona. It's not just, the expectations of the genre or the type of music or the performance setting is part of it. Business decisions, managerial decisions can be part of it. Of course, the desires of the particular performer can be part of it. And I think the audience is also part of it, because ultimately, and this is something I also learned from Goffman, ultimately it's the audience that either accepts or rejects what's being offered to them as the persona. If the audience doesn't buy into it, then yeah, that's it. It's not going to go anywhere. So the audience too plays a really key role in terms of the defining and dissemination of the persona.
Okay, and Professor Auslander, last question. So we've heard a lot of theory tonight. We've done a lot of analysis. What do you think this means, or what could this mean for musicians, actual performers today and tomorrow?
Well, I would like to think that people who become a little more aware of this, musicians who become more aware of this, therefore become a little more conscious of this idea that when performing music for an audience, you are not just playing music, right? You are also engaged in a kind of self-presentation, and to think a bit more about that and how what's involved in that, and what the creative opportunities of that are. As a whole other part of what's happening in the performance than just the playing of music. I told you this, that some years ago I happened to be at a conference of some kind, and I ran into a guy who was the director of the Liverpool Conservatory at the time, and he said to me, look, we don't really train musicians to think about this dimension of performance, but we probably should. And I said, yes, you probably should. I think there's a little bit more perhaps of that kind of thing happening in music education, or the way musicians are trained, than in the past. But I think there's probably a lot more that could be done, just to make people more aware, just to make musicians more aware of themselves as performers, and what the opportunities are, what the opportunities can be from that awareness.
Fantastic. So let's see how we can stay in touch. Excuse me, how we can buy the book. There it is, In Concert, Performing Musical Persona by the University of Michigan Press. So it's available there. It is $39.95 hardcover. I will put that in the chat room right now for all who would like to buy it. And then let's see how we can stay in touch with Phil. It is auslander.lmc.gatech.edu. So people can reach out to you, Phil. Is that right? If they have
Oh
questions?
yes, absolutely. So yeah, that's right. My email address is my last name at GATECH, georgiatech.edu. But also I want to say I spent many hours in the last few weeks updating this website. So please go take a look. It's for you.
Fantastic.
All that work
Fantastic.
for you. Please go look.
So there's his website. Take a look and reach out to Professor Auslander if you have any questions. We have applause coming from the audience. Thank you so very much, Professor Philip Auslander. So let's take a look at what's coming up next week on Vienna Live, it is Dan Pugach, a composer and Grammy-nominated composer and drummer. He will be coming on next Wednesday. All information about upcoming shows may be found at www.simeonmoro.com. So that's next week, Dan Pugach. And so thank you so very much once again to Professor Philip Auslander. Thank you very much to Victoria and Frederick Mulligan and Agnieszka and Benoit Rivolet for their support of this show. Most of all, thanks to you, our participants who make it all worthwhile. From New London, New Hampshire and Atlanta, Georgia, goodbye and see you next Wednesday.
Bye.